What was your worst "I'm turning into my parents" moment? I can only hope that I turn into my father. That man is the most amazing, fantastic guy I've ever known. He worked his ass off to make my childhood as magical as it possibly could be. For my birthday every year, he told me that the fairies would help me celebrate. He had me shove sticks into the ground outside, and he would always switch them out for my favorite flowers. One or two of them were always those fake roses with chocolate flowers. The fairies would also always leave me a piñata. It would usually be a sun, doused in glitter, and would always be left on our big tree in the backyard. Inside were all my favorite candies, and a toy wrapped in green wrapping paper. For Christmas, he would leave special handwritten notes from Santa Claus, and even paid our neighbor, who had a horse, to leave hoof prints in the snow outside. On the days leading up to St. Patrick's Day, we would construct a leprechaun trap. I'd wake up only to find tiny footprints everywhere, and a pile of gold dollars. They were always too sneaky for us to catch. On Easter, the bunny would always leave me presents, and a lot of eggs. But aside from all these super awesome things my dad did for me, there were bigger, more meaningful things he was always sure to do. For example, he always made sure that I feel heard. If I ever have a problem, he listens. He doesn't always have advice, but he's there, and that's what's most important. It didn't matter if the problem seemed small to him because he knew it was big to me. He's always been one of my best friends, there for advice when I need it, for a hug or a shoulder to cry on. Hell, he did some truly silly things that I know he got teased for. I can distinctly remember him letting me paint his nails before work, which looked silly AF. My dad's about 6'2", and at the time was easily 200 pounds. But he went above and beyond all that. He taught me self-defense. He was a boxer back in the day. He taught me how to deal with anger and sadness in a healthy way. He also made it very clear that if anyone touched me, he'd kill them. He was my rock. He both kept me grounded and encouraged me to soar. He nurtured my creative side and encouraged my scientific one as well. I want to be exactly that for my son. I never want him to question whether or not I love him, whether or not he can come to me for absolutely anything. I've done my dead-level best to drill into my child that there's nothing he can ever do to make me stop loving him, that I will always protect him, that anything he says to me will die with me, that his problems and concerns are never too small or too big for me to help with. I really hope that one day I have that "holy crap, I'm my father" moment. Beautiful story to get us started today. That is honestly not what I was expecting. I think later down the line, we're going to see more stories of people that are assuming perhaps less admirable traits of their parents or perhaps traits that they resented when they were younger. But that's just such a wholesome story. And just want to thank OP for sharing that with us. Story 2. So I'm at IHOP one day, already finished with breakfast, on my second cup of coffee, and the waiter comes with the bill. As I pull out my debit card to pay it, I put my wallet away and think to myself, just let me sit here and enjoy my coffee. Which is a phrase that my mother has used so many times at breakfast that she could patent it. I'll admit, it does feel nice to just relax and enjoy it instead of rushing out the door as soon as you're done. Now it's something I do routinely. Edit. Indeed, I realize I can pay the bill and not leave immediately. It's just this one moment I vividly recall not doing so. Also, I probably should have mentioned that the town I live in is pretty small, and IHOP is usually quite dead most of the time. Otherwise, I wouldn't take it upon myself to make people wait for a table while I'm just there sipping coffee. Story 3. Christ, where to effing begin? I find myself tucking in my shirts for the warmth. I've collected a tremendous amount of Mickey Mouse decor without even realizing it was happening. I find myself saying, "My goodness gracious," all the time. My father says this, never cusses. Up until a few years ago, I had an embarrassingly vile mouth. I've become more and more cynical about our local sports team's ownership and find myself ignoring good sense/analysis and wanting them to get a guy who can just go out there and win. I bought a digital TV antenna just to watch repeats of Emergency. I now own multiple pairs of jorts. I reinstalled and put like 40 hours into Blue Bites, The Settlers 2. I was really excited to get a measuring tape for Christmas. I referred to a signing competition show as appointment viewing. I had a talk with our neighbors because their kids keep getting into our yard while playing football and they trample through my planter. Felt weird doing that since I'm 26 years old and their dad had 2 decades on me. I installed Nextdoor, but not for trolling. This is all fairly benign, but altogether, I'm a very boring, married 20-something. Story 4. About 4.5 years ago, my husband asked me for a divorce. I had spent years with him being unhappy, demanding, and quick to anger, and then too much of a coward to break up with him. The final straw was when I cheated on him. I was a real piece of crap. Shortly afterwards, I found out I was pregnant with his baby. I had this moment of clarity where I pictured the rest of my life as a probably single mother, resenting this kid and being an angry female dog to everyone I met. It chilled me to the core because it reminded me so much of my mother. She is the type to constantly remind her kids that she wishes she never had any of us, that it was our fault that she stayed in not one, but two crappy marriages, the first of which ended because of her infidelity. She's constantly mean and angry, and I still suffer from the effects of growing up with her abusive crap. I realized in that moment that I'd turned into my mother, almost exactly. I got an abortion and a divorce, and 4 years later I'm happy, no contact with my mother, mentally much healthier, and looking forward to having kids with my partner when we're ready. The right way. Story 5. My grandmother has really bad anxiety about people's safety or if they're alive. Example, when I was young, she would come into the bedrooms and make sure my younger brother and me were breathing. This happened my entire life if I stayed at her house. Example 2. She constantly worries about someone choking on food. If you're on the road and she knows it, she'll call you 50 times to make sure you're okay. Example 3. I let my little brother outside to play on our porch once, and she had to constantly remind me to not let him go to the river a mile away, or he would drown and we wouldn't be able to find him. My mom has recently started acting like this as she's gotten older. Not quite to the extent of my grandma, but occasionally she will have a moment where she's really worried about something simple. Even more recently, this sort of worrying has started hitting me. I noticed this a month ago when my half-sibling, 5 years old, lay down to go to bed. He wanted a snack, so I went and grabbed something small for him to eat before bed. Before I left, I told him that if he got choked and I wasn't able to hear him, to come in and wake me up by hitting me if he had to. At first, I played this off by justifying that he's 5 and kids tend to choke easily. You can never be too safe, but it dawned on me that this sort of thinking was high levels of worry, so I'm very much beginning to act like my elders. You know, there's an old saying, you're a product of your environment, so if you grow up with this kind of like overprotection and paranoia, it's bound to rub off on you subconsciously, and then ultimately as you get older, you realize that you've assumed those same traits, so that totally checks out. Story 6. My dad's an a-hole who jumps to conclusions and refuses to see multiple sides to a situation. Usually he gets unjustifiably pissed at a situation, thinking that his side is the only side, and the crap storm ensues. Realize that I share similar traits, especially when a situation pisses me off. I'm working on it and have always been much better at seeing all sides to a situation before making a decision, but occasionally some things just push the right buttons and I snap. I'm hoping that by recognizing the similarities and the fact that I despise these traits in my dad so much, it will help me steer clear of turning into him. Story 7. My mom is well known for her relax time, fluffy robe and slippers, sitting in one of those big armchairs, sipping wine and singing along to music. One day, I found myself in a fluffy robe and slippers, sitting in a big armchair, sipping wine and listening along to music. I gently spazzed, throwing the robe off. Significant other was confused, so I explained it. Then he pointed out, like 1,000 other things I do like my mom. I gave in, put the robe back, and said, F it, I guess I'm my mom now. Could be worse. Story 8. I don't get angry easily. Even annoyance takes a bit. When I do finally get pushed to the point of anger, I struggle to contain it. One day at work, things got me boiling over. I seriously needed to go home so I could calm down, but had to stay to finish some stuff that someone else was supposed to have done. Part of why I got angry. As I was putting condiments away, I dropped a vinegar bottle. I picked it up and slammed it onto the shelf so hard that I shattered the really thick glass bottle and screamed, F! By the way, I rarely cuss. It took everything I had to not throw things and completely lose control. That's when I realized that I was my mother. Thankfully, I was able to keep relatively calm until my shift ended. Once the rage passed, I broke down crying. Being like that terrifies me. I'm extremely grateful that I was mostly able to keep control and didn't completely lose it like my mother. I now try even harder to not let myself get angry. When I notice that I'm stewing about something negative, I try to just let it go. So while I do think that it's healthy to have this level of self-awareness that you're on the verge of snapping, should also probably caution against just bottling things up because it's only a matter of time before they boil over into these crazy explosions. So maybe just find an outlet to release your frustration. Story 9. Over the holidays, I discovered that my father and I have the same jokes. We didn't even see each other a lot when I was growing up. I saw him like 4 times a year. He was testing out his new soundbar by playing Jurassic Park, and he gets to the scene where the goat leg drops on the car. We both at the same time point at the TV and whisper, "I found the goat," to our significant others. 1 minute later, the lawyer runs to the toilet, and at the exact same time, we both say, "That guy dies." Both deadpan, same intonation, same pitch. Then we both laughed at our own joke, and it was again the same pitch with the same duration, band, the same peaks and valleys. Identical. Story 10. It helps that I live in China, where all this crap is delicious, but I regularly bliss out on food that would make my 16-year-old self question his very existence and true inner nature if he were to see himself enjoy such things in the future. Hearing myself say things like, "Oh yeah, I need a treat, let's go get some eggplant. Wow, this place has roasted broccoli. Can we get it with extra garlic? Dude, pass the seaweed. Raw fish. Yeah, baby. Woohoo! Spicy chicken feet. This tofu has a hot pepper that makes my mouth turn numb," would make young me question if an alien abduction had taken place. Honestly, one of my favorite things about getting older is my palate completely changing. I would be so freaking bored if I still wanted to stuff sweets in my face all the time. Story 11. About half a year ago, I was at a family gathering. My dad went to the bathroom, and I went right after he came back. When I got back to the table, my mom asked me, "Do you want ice in your beer?" I was like, "What the F?" So I said, "Why the hell would I want ice in my beer?" The whole table just burst into laughter. Turns out it's a little prank to me and my dad, and I said the exact same phrase as he did. He's been quite a serious and strict person throughout my childhood, so we were never really close, at least not as close as me and my mom. He barely showed any feelings to me that I almost forgot he has them. I sat there for about 10 minutes or so, thinking that my dad must also have had an inner voice of WTF when he was being asked. Then, suddenly, I thought about all the feelings he would have had when I neglected and disrespected his efforts and me because I was too young to comprehend. I wept so bad that my whole family was terrified, but I never told them why I cried. Getting better with old man recently, but you know these things take time. But it's getting better at least. Story 12. My mother was nearly stationary on the couch in the last 15 or so years of her life. Her health became so bad that she really couldn't do much. Yet, despite childhood trauma and lifelong issues with that, it was her body that broke down. In my case, it's my mental health that frittered away everything I had going to me, so that I've already spent more than a year barely ever setting foot outside, and it's now very difficult for me to motivate myself to run necessary errands. The moment you're referring to happened only a couple months ago. I woke up feeling fresh and rested, and immediately thought that what awaited me for the rest of the day was a lot of passive sitting around. So I wanted simply never to get up, but just lie there for whatever short length of time the rest of my life lasted without ingesting any fluids. I finally got up only because I needed to change positions, and sitting is different from lying down. That feeling has receded, but since then, I've barely been able to do anything that actually needs doing. I'm out of medication, and the refills are waiting at the pharmacy about a 3-minute walk away, but I can't talk myself into putting my shoes on and stepping out that apartment door. Story 14. This will get buried and is pretty embarrassing, but as an adult, I heard my parents fighting one night, like really arguing hard with swears and door slamming, mostly coming from my mom. I was staying with them for a few days, but I hadn't lived at home in years, and this was genuinely the first time I had ever heard them fight like this. I had been having some serious issues in my own relationship, mostly communicating my anger and emotions in a healthy way. Suddenly, I heard myself in the way my mom was behaving, and everything that I had been struggling with in my own life suddenly snapped into place. The next week was hugely eye-opening as I thought back to how I was raised, with a lot of emotional permissibility, and the behaviors that my parents had been demonstrating, and I realized that I had been trying to recreate that dynamic with my partner. It changed my life. I picked apart the good and bad things about myself that I'd learned from my family, and now consider myself a very self-aware person. It's really thanks in part to this fight I heard between my parents. Story 15. Apart from my accent, I would say both my reclusiveness and my emotional cynicism. Practically every man in my family, dating back to the Napoleonic Wars, was an officer in the British Army. My father was no different. From 1976 to 2006, he served in Rhodesia, South Africa, Falklands, and finally Iraq. From what I learned from my grandfather, every time my father came back from tour, he was always mellowed, as he put it, to the point where by the 2000s you would be lucky enough to get more than 2 words out of him. I only met him twice before he died, but I talked to a few of my father's former subordinates to learn what he did in the 80s and 90s. Suffice to say, he saw some things, especially during his time in Africa. I always thought, growing up, my acquired cynical trait was just something I learned from my experiences, but it turns out it seems to run in the family. Now I discover more and more that my beliefs and ideas are directly in line with my Matthews, and that horrifies me. Story 16. This is dark and maybe TMI. My mom is extremely abusive and would get angry and hit and beat us and scream and take her rage out on us. As kids, you don't know any better, and you think that's how you interact with others. I remember the moment as a preteen, or young teen, getting mad and going to hit my little sister, and she cringed, preparing for me to hit her, and I realized what I was doing. I was becoming like her, my mom. It was the weirdest thing. It was almost like I saw a video montage in my head of how I wanted my future relationships to be with my siblings, and how I wanted my future me to be. And I realized you can't hurt people if you love them, and I wanted to have a good relationship with my little sister. She looked up to me and respected me, and here I was raising my hand about to strike her and break her little kid heart. Again. I was so disgusted with myself. I remember apologizing and saying that I was really, really sorry, and I would try very, very hard to never hit her again, and I think I hugged her. Pretty sure I cried, too. I vaguely remember apologizing to my siblings and telling them I wanted to be a better sister and have a better relationship with them, one by one. I also thankfully got to a point where my mom would try to antagonize me or come after me to hit me, when I was finally bigger than her, calmly put my foot down. She once came to hit me, and I had already tried to defuse the situation, to no avail. I decided she was done hitting me, tossed my milk in her face, put my cup down and fists up, and told her, quote, "I'm bigger and stronger than you. If you try to hit me, I will lay you out. You will never hit me again." She backed off and never hit me again. Story 17. As bad as this may sound, I hope that I can be the opposite of what my parents were to me. To keep things short, my mother and father had a ton of fights to the point that it gave me stress and anxiety in middle school. I'm sure that's unhealthy for a young child. My father had this form of punishment where if he didn't get his way or was angered, he would stop communicating with you, which he did frequently to my mother. A couple of years later, I have that moment where I fight with my siblings, and then I would stop talking to them for long periods of time. There was my "I'm turning into my parents" moment. I've gotten substantially better. I don't use no communication as a way of punishment, and instead try to communicate with the other person to come to terms. Something I want to pass to my kids is to be there for them constantly and help them any way I can. Story 18. When I was old enough to decide for myself when I would go to bed, my paternal grandmother is a night owl, my dad is a night owl, and so am I. That was the catalyst. Then I found myself mimicking some of the same things my dad does as a night owl, like snacks at like 1 in the morning. Usually it's healthy or reasonable foods, but on occasion I'll munch on potato chips, deciding I'll watch a movie even if I know I have things I have to get a jump on earlier in the morning than usual. Tame, but I usually take after a parent in that regard. Not as bad as my dad is about the night owl life. Dad, if you find this, I love you, lol, but sometimes you stay up too late, even for a night owl. Story 19. My dad is a rageaholic who runs on hate. He taught me how to hate, and he taught me how to yell and growl and curse. The moment I realized I was really becoming too much like him was also the first time I broke a controller. To my credit, I was 28, so I went a good long time respecting my hardware. My sister was living with me at the time. She was in the process of wrecking a ceramic frying pan by scorching spices into its surface, filling the apartment with eye-burning smoke. Not actually a huge deal. I got the pan free, and my job involves dust and smoke, so I can deal. But that, combined with the bullcrap from the game, led me to hurling the controller to the floor. When she came back into the room, she wanted to give the challenge a try, but when she picked up the controller, the joystick was smashed right down through the board. She asked what happened, and I told her, and started growling and cursing and getting louder, and she asked me why I was so upset. And in a moment of clarity, my actual response was, because I'm turning into Dad. And ever since, I've noticed myself getting angrier and angrier, faster and faster, at dumber and dumber things. So I guess I was right. As long as I never take it out on another person, at least I know I'm not entirely like him. Story 20. Trying to feed everyone. It's so sad. My mom grew up in hard times in former USSR, and my years growing up were not too fruitful by any means, but I'll always remember her bringing home elderly neighbors and even some homeless folks who would be hiding in the middle of the Ukrainian winter. -40 degrees Fahrenheit, in the lobby of the building. We didn't have much, but she always made sure to share and care. I thought it was crazy back then, thought we should try to save our resources instead. My significant other cannot believe that I now have adopted some elderly neighbors of my own. He thinks I'm insane. Some old lady comes every Saturday to drink coffee with us, and I can't help it. We make breakfast for all, and I bring up food to some other elderly neighbors when I cook for us too. It gets even worse. We got a puppy who's gotten an ear infection and therefore stopped eating as much for a few days. All I could think about is how hungry she must be. Sat with her and fed small portions. It's so sad, and I fully comprehend how insane it is, but it's just something my mom instilled in me. Story 21. I realized I was almost becoming like my father when I almost struck down / hit my girlfriend after she admitted to being unfaithful. We've since worked things out through a lot of talking and things are fine, but thank the Lord I never actually did hit her. My father was a closet alcoholic and worked 14 plus hours every day. Never spoke to his own kids and our mom, never spent time with us, and he was physically violent towards my mom if something pissed him off. I swore to myself I'd never become like him. And almost hitting my girlfriend made me realize I was almost as bad of a person as him, and I've been doing my best since then to change ways. Story 22. I live 1,000 miles away from my parents. At my office, I was having a phone conversation with a client, and the client was being vague, contradictory, and dumb. I had left the door to my office open and had to pause to close it, then more or less give the client a dressing down for conducting irresponsible behavior that endangered his own interests. Sometime later, a coworker from a different department, whom I'd never spoken with before, said that he overheard me and my tone of voice and cadence reminded him of a professor he had, and asked if I was related. He did, indeed, have my father as a professor. Despite English being his third or fourth language, me being in a different state entirely, I'm just like my dad. My partner also tells me I walk exactly like him as well. Story 23. When I was growing up, our house had a wood fire. Whenever one of us kids went outside to get a log for the fire, we'd leave the door open, so we wouldn't have to work the doorknob with our arms full. And Dad would go into this mad tirade about hot air and cold air. It's nothing without the emphasis. Every word must be treated as life-savingly important, and delivered slowly and forcefully, as if you're speaking to a deaf idiot. But Dad would lecture us that if the door is open, hot air goes out and cold air comes in, and if the door is closed, hot air stays in and cold air stays out. I love doing it now. Every opportunity I have to explain the dynamics of hot and cold air through various doorways to him, I'm on it. Story 24. Not my parent, but I catch myself turning in my grandpa sometimes. Growing up, my grandparents lived right next door, and when I was old enough, I worked for my grandma doing maintenance for the town. We'd spend 35 plus hours a week working together, and he was basically my best friend. Well, one day in college, probably 2 years after having moved 4 hours away and barely seeing my family anymore, I caught myself pulling over in the middle of the road, picking up a screwdriver that someone had dropped and thinking, well, I don't see why anyone would throw away a perfectly good screwdriver. I told my grandma about it and she relayed the story to him. He's hard of hearing, so he never takes phone calls, and he just told her to tell me to make sure and put my name on it, which I did. Story 25. Low-key paranoia? When we were kids, my siblings and I would roll our eyes or laugh at our mom when she would delay an outing by going back into the house to double-check the oven was off, windows closed, etc. She did this so often that it was kind of annoying at times, especially when the second guessing would happen when we were in the car. Like, she'd drive back a mile or two to make sure she didn't run anyone over, or because her mind was drifting and she couldn't remember. As if the 4 kids in the car wouldn't have said, "Hey mom, you just hit a person." Anyway, now I find myself having to check and recheck the heater controls in each room, worry if the coffee pot is unplugged, and have walked back from the bus stop to make sure I lock the door. It's scary, and I'm annoying myself. So while that is overly paranoid, I think mistakenly thinking that you ran somebody over, it might be a bit overkill, so at least you're not at that level yet. Story 26. When I jump to conclusions, here's an example. Someone was hit by a subway train, on a line I'm virtually never on, at like 3 p.m. My mom texts me at 6 p.m. just saying my name, and I reply, "What's up?" because I'm at work and I have to be quick. However, because I texted her in English and not in Spanish, she calls me about 13 times and texts me 7 times. I step away from work to call her because I'm thinking something nuts is going on. I call her and nothing was happening. She thought that because I texted her in English that someone had stolen my phone, pushed me in front of the train, and responded to her text that she sent 3 hours after the fact saying, "What's up?" I've jumped to all kinds of conclusions in my head, and at that moment, I realized where I get it from. Story 27. For most of my teenage years, I always thought my father didn't care about those less fortunate. He was always outspoken about things like welfare, this is in the US for context, higher taxes he accumulated for being a doctor, and his general stance on inequality. When I was in high school, I was aggressively liberal. I believed that abuses in the system were worth it, if it meant that the few people who needed support for their families were receiving it. He constantly challenged my beliefs on humanity, as his often differed. I always took it as a sign that he didn't care about people outside of his circle. My mother told me he was extremely generous when they first got together, but I couldn't believe it. I saw no proof. A few winters ago, while we were driving around, she took me to the neighborhood I was born in, not in the highest income area, and showed me all the playground sets my dad would donate to families every year. That's when it hit me. My dad had never once made me feel ashamed of my views of the world, and never tried to change them. He posed difficult questions for a teenager to think about, and made me question my own beliefs on topics I felt so strongly about. He never lost his generosity, and just chose to see past it because it wasn't in my frame of what I thought was the best way to make a difference. Even as a young adult, I'm going to school to be an English language arts teacher, and he's never once put me down for choosing a career path that wouldn't accumulate wealth like his. He has only encouraged me to put my best effort forward and make the change that I would like to see. I'm proud to say that beyond our similarities in personality, the sound of our voices, and love for Japanese steakhouses, I'm exactly like my father. It took me a long time to realize it, let alone admit it, but I have no shame in it whatsoever. Story 28. When I was a teen, I remember my dad used to be furious if we didn't take the trash cans in. He would put them out the night before trash day as the garbage men came early in the morning, but always after the family had left for work/school so that they sat out all day until somebody got home. Generally, the rule was first one home took them in. So that would be the kids, as obviously school ends before the standard workday. Ever so often, my siblings and I would forget. Not maliciously, we were just dumb teens, and like many teens, occasionally failed to think about things outside our own bubble. Anyway, if we were all watching TV in the evening or whatever, my dad would come in furious that nobody had taken the cans in. Or he would make a big show about dragging them in himself. But he was always mad as hell that nobody did it. I remember thinking it wasn't a big deal, we just forgot. And if he asked, we would do it so he didn't have to. I couldn't understand why anyone would get so angry about a stupid trash can. Fast forward, I'm an adult in my 30s with a home I share with my partner. When I come home from work on trash day and he's inside already, but not taking the cans in, I feel irrationally angry. He has to walk by the cans to get to the front door. Why not just drag them in on his way? I could ask him to, but why can't he figure it out by himself? I think it's because I'm tired after a long day and it's just another chore to do, but now I totally get my dad's can rage. Anyway, I'm sorry for being a dumbass teen and not taking the cans in, Dad. I get it now. Story 29. This just happened like 2 days ago. D equals 7-year-old daughter. M equals me, mama. Sarah, name changed due to the fact that they're 7 and they're BFFs.
Hey mama, look! Sarah gave me a chapstick! She got a whole set for Christmas!
Well, that was nice. Was her mom okay with that?
Yeah, she's the one who gave it to me.
Well, okay then. How was the sleepover?
Great!
Insert rant in full detail of 2 little girls and their sleepover.
Mama, I like this chapstick. It makes my lips pink, just like lipstick. Mama, can you buy me lipstick, please?
No, hun, you're too young for lipstick.
But Mama,
insert girl's name,
at school wears lipstick.
No, just because your friend wears lipstick doesn't mean you get to. You're too young. We'll talk about this again when you're older. Daughter walks away, pouting. I realize I said it without thinking about it. It rolled off my tongue. I just said exactly what my mother had said to me, but I was older than D. I had to call my older sister to tell her. She laughed at me and has been sending me, "You know you've turned into your mom/dad jokes for the past 2 days. So there's my story, my first of what I assume will be many. I know that it only gets worse from here. Story 30. My mother never let us eat in our rooms growing up. She would always say the dinner table is there for a reason, and if she ever caught us with food in our rooms, it would be a big deal. One night, a few years ago, my husband started to eat chocolate in bed. No big deal. I just told him to make sure he didn't drop any in bed. We have white bed sheets. I fall asleep and wake up randomly at night because I felt something sticky in my inner thigh. I turn on the lights and sure enough, there's melted chocolate all over the place. I wake him up and tell him I never want to see you eat in our bedroom ever again. Not one piece of food, candy, or drink that's not water. I immediately realized I turned into my mother. Yeah, point notwithstanding about eating in bed, definitely agree with that. But white bed sheets, why? They're just such high maintenance. I don't get that. Well, high maintenance if you want to keep them clean and white, that is. But nah, I digress. It's getting kind of gross. Story 31. In his youth and middle age, my father always had a stalwart and slightly intimidating look on his face. Think Clint Eastwood when he's reaching his limit of someone else's BS. It was his default expression, and when he was younger, he bore a passing resemblance to Eastwood as well, although not as tall. I swore I'd be more approachable and open, but once I hit 35, the face crept in, and now here I am with it as my default too. No matter what I do, it's my face's resting state. My wife has had other women ask her what I'm like in private, and when she tells them, they're always shocked, having assumed I was a hard man. Story 32. A few years ago, I, a man, had grown my hair out a bunch. I was looking over my Snapchat stories list to see the thumbnail for my story had a picture of my mom wearing sunglasses on it, a photo I've never seen before. Looking over it, I realized it was a selfie that I had taken with the big round sunglasses filter earlier that same day. That was the moment I realized that I looked exactly like my mom, and that I needed a haircut. Edit. Another story. One time, I was hanging out at my girlfriend's place, and we were both sitting on her bed getting some homework done. I made her get up so I could make her bed. She was watching me with tears in her eyes, telling me how sweet I am, etc., while I was just thinking about how stressful it was sitting on a bunch of tousled blankets and sheets with pencils, books, chargers, etc., scattered around getting lost. I realized how much of my mom I had truly become. Story 33. Not me, but a good friend of mine. Throughout his university life, he was constantly annoyed by how his parents controlled him. Could never party or do anything on account of them being so controlling. He finally moves out and gets a girlfriend, but can't help but helicopter over her, and is always wary of her own partying life. She's still in university. My friend's major quirk is that he never dresses for the weather, and complains it's too hot or cold. One night, as our group of friends is hanging around the fire pit, my friend in question arrives in a t-shirt coming from a daily dinner. Starts to female dog that's too cold. We all call him out for never being prepared, and his gut response is, well, my dad didn't bring his jacket out today, so I thought it was fine. Story 34. My family is all about football. It's practically our life. New England Pats forever, lol. Anyways, during each game, if anyone talks, my dad will shush them, and it's so funny how serious he got over it, and our whole family would laugh, and it's just a great time. One day, my dad had to leave to go somewhere and didn't watch the game with us. Anytime anyone would talk, I would shush them and get all angry, and I would get super into the game, and when my mom pointed it out, I realized how alike I came to him. I noticed so many similarities since then. We always tense and annoy our family for fun, and we get really defensive over the same politics and over sports teams, and we even talk the same and have the same demeanor. It's crazy. Story 35. Getting upset with the bagger at the grocery store. I was always so embarrassed when my dad used his stern dad voice and told the bagger he'll bag his own groceries. 10 years later, I get a gallon of milk bagged with hot dog buns and a bag of grapes with raw, wet chicken. I asked them to step aside, and I did it myself. They refused, and I had to use a stern voice to get them to back off. I called my dad on the drive home that day, and he laughed to the point of tears. For clarity, this was not a special needs person I shamed away. This was a high school-age boy who did not appear to have any disability other than wanting to be someplace else. Story 36. Less I'm becoming my parents, and more my parent is becoming me. I love anime and have been watching animated stuff since I was a little kid. Recently, I've gotten into some of the more adult animes, Tokyo Ghoul, Attack on Titan, etc. I recommended some to my dad as he likes shows with good story, but he never really got anime. Well, August 2018 rolls around. He falls off a ladder at work and is on work comp for 4 to 5 months. He decides, you know what, Tears of LA recommended some of these, I might as well watch them. He started out pretty normal, just watching the popular stuff, but as time has gone forward, he had gone deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. Now he's watching creepy slice of life stuff, dating animes, lolly idol stuff, and it's really strange that the 6'1", bald, 40-plus construction worker is sitting there talking to me about zombie teenage girls reincarnated to sing at concerts. I know I introduced him to it, but his obsession reminds me of 16-year-old me, but much weirder and into stranger stuff. Story 37. There was 2 instances. One, I was with my grandmother and my 3 young cousins, 2 6-year-olds and a 9-year-old. We're running all over yelling and throwing things. After my grandmother had yelled a few times for them to quiet down, being time to start settling down for bed. My grandmother asked me to put a blanket on the floor for them to lay on, get a set of PJs for all of them, and put on a movie. So I did. They were still running wild, being hyper kids, and my grandmother wasn't really keeping up with them, and her patience had reached its end. She asked me to use my dad's voice and tell them to sit down. I yelled and told them that they needed to stop and listen to Grandma. I guess I did too well. They all started crying and ran to my grandmother. I felt bad, but my grandmother laughed. The second time, we were at a family get-together. My cousins, sisters, brothers, dad and stepmom, uncles and aunt, their partners, a couple of family friends. One of my younger sisters was talking to my dad about car problems, and I knew my dad didn't want to deal with it at that moment, so I wasn't doing anything. So I told my sister to give me her keys. I go look at her cars, check fluids, listen to hear if I hear anything odd, all pretty basic stuff. I come back to her talking to my dad. I ask her when the last time she checked her fluids was. She gets quiet because I knew she never did. She needed oil, transmission fluid, her power steering could be topped off. Needed her exhaust to be mounted back up, and she had a hole in a fuel line. I gave her keys to my dad. She turns to my other sister and says, "He's just like Dad now." Yep. Story 38. It was when I caught my nephew's friend smoking weed at 14 during a sleepover. I went in to give him a hug and say goodnight when I stopped and sniffed. Then I went full parent and shut the door so quick that none of the little bastards could escape. I basically said, "All right, who has it? Where's the weed? Who's smoking weed in my house? I'm 30 and I don't even smoke weed in my house. And you think you can come in here? You're all stupid as F. I thought you were all laughing, but now I'll be the one laughing while I'll call everyone's parents." I found it, and my nephew went to talk. I ended up giving the glare only a pissed off parent could do. I silenced those kids and had their attention for 2 hours. I knew the new kid had the weed, but I wasn't going to let the other slide. I spent an hour and a half talking to each and every one of them, one by one, in the most serious tone. All of them came out one by one with their head down and brought them downstairs. Some backstory on why it's crazy. I was a stoner myself and started taking care of my nephew at the age of 16 when my sister left him. I've never gone full parent mode like that around any of the little craps until that night. They thought I was the cool uncle, but the second I changed, they knew they effed up. The older kid who brought the weed, he ended up spilling his guts while crying. I talked to him last and hugged him while he bawled his eyes out. I won't go into detail, but his mother was judge and his father was a lawyer. I honestly felt bad for him and told him how disrespectful it is to bring drugs in someone else's house like that. I also told him I have him recorded on my clock, and if I ever catch him smoking and the other 3 younger kids, I'll post the entire thing to his parents. It was a lie, but last time I heard, he quit smoking. After an hour or 2 of my flipping, I took the weed and flushed it. I then made them some frozen pizza for breakfast the next morning and told the kids the secret is safe with me. I haven't smelt weed in my house since. They can take that crap somewhere else. Story 39. I have an answer for this one. My dad helped me with math homework when I was a kid. I was really lazy about it and wouldn't write out all the steps or label the units, thinking I could just do it in my head and save myself some time. It didn't. I had to redo a lot of work listening to my dad lecture me about the importance of not skipping steps and including labels. I'm teaching geography now at a community college now, and one of the labs we were working on, we had to convert units. Students were coming up to me to check their answers, and a bunch of them were getting the same thing wrong. I realized what the problem was and told them to remember to label their units because that's where they had gone wrong. I said that and realized I had become my father and had an existential crisis for the rest of the lab. Story 40. Growing up, my mom worked night shift and would get home and sleep during the day. We all, 5 kids, made sure not to make too much noise and wake her up because when she got up, it didn't matter who did it. She would yell at all of us and find something we all had to do. Chores, homework, etc., and would bring up things that she may have let slide had she woke up by herself. Well, a few years ago, I moved out with my sister and my now 2-year-old niece. I work nights. A few months ago, my sister put on the TV to like a million while I was trying to sleep, woke me up, and I went off about all the little things that had been bugging me for the last while. The TV being too loud, the mess from my niece. A few days later, I was driving over to my parents, and it hit me that I totally just did the same thing my mom had done growing up. Yeah, I think it's just like a human defense mechanism. We're all just slightly more irritable when being awoken abruptly. That's personally one of my own personal pet peeves as well, is like, don't mess with my sleep. Play all the jokes you want during waking hours, but if I'm asleep, leave me alone. Story 41. Most of what I see are happy, so I get to be the bummer here. I don't have the best people for parents, an emotionally and physically abusive father and a drunk, crazy but caring mother. The past couple of months, I found out that, to my dismay, I'm becoming more and more like my father. I recently was broken up with my long-term girlfriend. We had been together for 6 years, and I thought it was going to go forever, until I realized that I was mentally abusive to her. I would always tell her that her emotions didn't matter, that she would only worry how I feel. I would yell at her for crying when there was something really wrong happening, and I'd either be on my computer or trying to sleep. I'd totally ignore her for days on end to just sit on my computer and talk to my friends. She always would treat me with the utmost respect and love, and it pains me to realize that I'm turning into my father. He would scream at me and my sister when we were kids, tell us we were worthless, and threaten violence against us all the time. There were even times he would be physically violent to me in particular. It all came to a head one day when he was arrested for some physical abuse to my mother. Growing up around that, I never knew anything different, and I'm sad that I've become so much like the man I've grown to hate. Story 42. I was at work. I had been picking up more and more of my coworkers' slack lately, and it was making my job absolutely physically grueling. I remember walking through this huge aisle of industrial lathes, just thinking about how useless and lazy my coworkers are, just silently cursing them all in my head, when I realized that words and inflections I'm using in my own internal voice sound exactly like how my dad would curse people when he was annoyed. The same words, the same super specific cadence he has, he might as well have put the words in my head telepathically. I quite literally stopped in my tracks on the warehouse floor, had to compose myself for a moment. My mom always said it was amazing how much I reminded her of my dad, but it was the first time that I ever noticed it myself. Story 43. It came to me when my drinking got out of hand. I would have a drink every night, and not just a beer. I mean the hard stuff like whiskey or rum. My favorite one was Jack Daniel's Tennessee Honey or Kraken. Every time I would go out with my friends, I would always drink until I blacked out. Every morning, when I would wake up, my first thought would be, what the F did I do last night? My friends would tell me, dude, you need to control your drinking. You become an a-hole and just say the worst things to us. But I didn't listen for years. One New Year's party, I went out to my friend's get-together with my girlfriend, sister, and friend. Got super effed up and woke with the whole, what the F happened? My girlfriend told me how horrible I was to her and how I kept calling her names and breaking up with her. I didn't know what to say. When she was telling me all this stuff, it just hit me. I am my dad. He did this crap all the effing time to my mom. Now I'm just repeating the cycle. I broke down and cried, and since then have been working on changing that. Story 44. Well, lately, I've just started to notice a lot of similarities in my life now versus that of my parents' lives back when I was a kid. But now I'm looking at it from the adult's perspective. Weird, maybe. Childhood was its own unique brand of effed up. Whose isn't? I know. With a nasty divorce and my mom becoming a single mom, dealing with two pretty angry/sad kids, on top of being angry and sad herself. This was in the 80s. Divorce was still fairly new. There's a strong divide on whether my dad actually cheated per se, and to top it off, we went to a private Catholic school. Yeah, let that one sink in. Anyway, I was a pretty sad, angry, judgmental ass of a kid, now that I look back on it. So I had plenty of thoughts about how my mom was raising us. Why can't I get new clothes? Everyone has an Esprit bag. Why can't I get real Keds with the blue tab on back other than these fake ones? I don't even want to be seen in Kmart. Why are we going there? Yeah, I was that insecure. As the years have passed, I find myself in a similar position, and it's kind of like a bit of a light went off. I'm having to play the parent to a pretty pissed off tween whose parents are not on the best of terms and who's getting shuttled all around without much say in the matter. I freelance, so work can be a struggle, so I have to say no to things my daughter asks for with big, pleading eyes. Sucks to have to say no. I can see why people with tons of cash spoil their kids. That look your kids give you is like a sword made of guilt aimed right at your heart. Also, I'm freaking tired. Like, tired. There's work when it happens, long ass commute, dealing with irritating people, dinner for grouchy, hungry kid, shuttle to soccer, slumber party, school events, what have you. Make sure to actually try and bond with your kid. Oh, and keep the house clean. What the F? I remember those days distinctly as a 12-year-old thinking how unfair it all was. Why was our house messy all the time? Why can't you pick me up earlier? I hate daycare. Why do I need to get up so early? It isn't fair. Real brat now that I think about it. Explain some things, I suppose. Now the shoe's on the other foot, and I'm like, damn, Gina, this parenting crap is hard. So many more weird ass coincidences of almost like reliving the circumstances of my childhood, but now in the role of an adult. Gives me new respect for my mom, who's a total badass, by the way, operating room nurse. I hyperventilate when I have to give blood. She raised my brother and I, and looking back, I'm quite in awe of all she did, and I can definitely say I altered my parenting methods based on some of my past experiences. I'm doing things quite a bit differently, as most of us do, I would guess, but it's funny to see some of your parents' quirks show up in yourself. I guess we shall see when my kid grows up if she thinks I did a good job. On a funny note, on my 40th, my mom inadvertently ran through a screen door, something my clumsy ass has done on numerous occasions. Once it was not even the screen, just a face bouncing off the glass. Super classy over here. Anyway, my mom yelled out to us horrible people laughing, me, "You would be so bored without me." I was literally like, "You have got to be kidding me." That's literally the mantra I whip out every time I do some dumb crap and people are cracking up at me. I just sat back and shook my head, just realizing despite my best efforts to be the complete opposite of my mother when I grew up, some of those endearing quirks of my mom made it through. Guess it's not all that bad. Story 45. My parents are still married, but I realized pretty early how unhealthy their relationship was, and how much resentment there was between them. They barely spend any time together nowadays, and I always thought deeply about how not to end up that way. My SO and I had a fight once, and he told me that I never expressed my emotions when I was feeling hurt or down. I keep it all bottled up, and it ends up exploding somehow over something tiny. That's when I realized how similar to my mom I was becoming, and how she'd held everything in all the time and built up so much resentment. I really try hard to express my feelings productively nowadays, and to ask for change and help when needed, instead of brooding and letting the frustration accumulate. It changed my relationships a lot. I kept thinking I needed to keep the perfect happy girl facade for a guy to like me. Turns out, my SO is very happy to help me when something bothers me.